I was dreaming, and in the dream, I was back at the lake. The one I dreamt of before. The one in the forest. Trees loomed along the shore like hunched figures in mourning, their branches bare and clawing at the sky. Everything was hushed, as if the world itself were holding its breath. And she was there, again. The girl with the red hair, sitting at the edge of the lake with her toes in the water, her hair draped over her shoulders. She hummed softly, the same strange lullaby I remembered from before, only now it sounded even slower, even sadder, like a dirge played underwater. I tried to see her face, but it was turned away. Then came the shadow. It crept from the trees behind her. Tall, narrow, shapeless at first, but it grew denser as it moved, like smoke thickening into something solid. It leaned over her like a falling curtain, blotting out the pale sky. The girl stopped humming. Her body stiffened. Then she screamed. She was pushed into the lake. The shadow followed, tearing at her clothes, folding over her like ink spilling into milk. I ran toward them, feet skidding over wet grass, heart pounding. I had to reach her. I had to stop it. The shore drew closer. I could see the water churning. I could almost hear her voice beneath the surface calling out to me, though my name was not one I recognized. And then, the shadow turned. It had a shape now. The shape of a man. No longer just darkness, but flesh. Skin pale as candle wax. Raven black curls swept back. Eyes black and deep. Eyes I recognized. The shadow was my father. I woke with a jolt. My nightshirt clinging to my skin, my mouth dry. The dream clung to me like fog that wouldn't lift. I could still see him, my father, hunched, hungry over the poor girl by the lake. I had always been haunted by dreams, ever since I was 7 years old and nearly drowned in the harbour outside Foxenberg. But never had the dreams been like this. I turned, pressed my face into my pillow, and shivered. I lunged forward, bringing my katana down in a sharp arc. Delara deflected the blow with a flick of her wrist, her own sword meeting mine in a clash that rang out across the empty training grounds. She didn't hesitate, twisting her body to the side and sweeping her leg toward mine, aiming to knock me off balance. I sidestepped, keeping my stance low, just like she taught me. For a heartbeat, our eyes met. Delara's gaze held a glint of approval, but there was no time to dwell on it. She struck again, faster this time, her movements a blur. I parried, gritting my teeth as I forced myself to match her speed. She circled around me, and I followed, our feet scuffing against the gravel. Her strikes were relentless, each one designed to find the cracks in my defense. A month ago, I would have folded after the first flurry. Now, I could hold my own, at least for a few minutes. But Delara was still better. Always better. She feinted left, and I fell for it, barely catching the mistake before she angled her blade toward my exposed side. I twisted away, but too slow. The flat of her blade connected with my ribs, the blow winding me as I stumbled back. "Too predictable," she said. I glared at her, catching my breath as I reset my stance. My arms ached, my ribs throbbed, and I could feel the bruise forming beneath my skin. 2 months of training every day, and I still couldn't get past her damn defenses. But I was getting closer. Slowly, steadily, I was getting closer. We resumed, stray petals falling around us as we clashed again. I'd lost count of the bruises and cuts I'd earned in this courtyard, but there was something deeply satisfying about each one. With every hit, every fall, I felt myself hardening, sharpening into something new. Our swords met in a furious exchange, each blow faster than the last, until we locked blades, my katana straining against hers. Delara was stronger than me, but I'd learned a trick or two. Instead of fighting her strength, I shifted my weight backward, letting her momentum carry her off balance. She stumbled, her eyes widening slightly in surprise, and I used the opening to slip free and strike. A moment later, I was staring at the sky, flat on my back. Delara stood over me, her sword leveled at my throat.
"Right on your butt," she said. "Don't worry. It happens to the best of us."
"So I've heard," I grunted, pushing myself up to a sitting position. But I almost had you this time." She raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. Then she sheathed her katana and held out a hand to help me up. I took it, letting her pull me to my feet, my muscles aching from the effort. I could already feel the bruises forming along my ribs and shoulders, but the pain was something I'd come to welcome. Proof that I was getting stronger. Proof that I could endure. As I brushed the gravel from my howry, I caught a glimpse of myself reflected in the nearby water trough. My hair was cropped short, just below my ears, and my face was leaner, harder. My arms, once soft, were now bruised and scarred, but with a strength I hadn't thought myself capable of. I wasn't as weak as I'd once been. Spring had come, and the temple seemed to rouse itself from winter's bleakness with a slow, shuddering breath. The heavy smell of rot, the same sickly, damp scent that had greeted me when I first arrived in October, was back. But now it was laid with the sweetness of new blossoms, a cloying, almost overripe fragrance that clung to the air. The ancient trees loomed above, twisted and gnarled, their bark dark and slick with moss, yet from their crooked branches burst fresh green leaves and splashes of colour, white, pink, and deep violet flowers, vibrant and defiant against the decay beneath. Insects with swollen, glassy eyes buzzed in lazy circles around the blossoms, drawn by the thick perfume. The vashias, sluggish from the winter frost, were finally stirring, their exoskeletons steaming in the sun as they gathered on the first terrace, where the Hanzira fed them under the spreading canopies. The whole temple seemed to pulse with a strange life, a mix of decay and renewal, a reminder that here, even rot could breed beauty. It was unsettling, ancient, and undeniably alive. A place where life and death intertwined in a way I hadn't appreciated before. The mossy stone paths felt soft beneath my feet, and I no longer felt the need for shoes. My howry, an essential shield against the cold of winter, now felt like unnecessary weight. I left it in my quarters and stepped outside, savoring the warm air seeping through the thin fabric of my kimono. The last 2 months of winter had passed in a blur, marked only by the rhythm of training and study. Each morning I would wake before dawn, my body sore, my hands blistered, and yet there was a strange comfort in the routine. I practiced my stances, ran drills until my muscles burned, and sat in quiet meditation as Azura taught me the language of the Ash Elves, the teaching of the Abyssal Ones, the hymns, the rites, the philosophy that had guided her people since the early days of the Age of Ash. In time, I found myself absorbing more than just the words. Azura's teachings began to settle in my bones, a dark, twisting logic that seeped into the cracks of my old beliefs. I couldn't say I believed it all. There were parts that still felt alien, even dangerous. But sometimes, in the quiet moments, I found comfort in the idea of surrendering to something deeper, something beyond myself. As spring deepened, I had come to understand this demoralized religion as best a foreigner could. I'd learned the stories of Vexlankar, of Zeraven, of Legina, and the dark realms beyond the veil. Myths that had once seemed like cruel fairy tales now resonated with a strange, eerie beauty. In some ways, the Abyssal Ones were as real to me as the Lormian gods of my childhood, but wilder, darker, and somehow truer. One day, as I stared into a polished shard of glass, I saw a face I barely recognized. My cheekbones were sharper, my gaze more intense. I had a scar on my throat and several others across my cheeks. One across the ridge of my nose, too. There was a hardness in my expression that hadn't been there before, a resilience that felt both foreign and entirely mine. The Emilia who had come here, the girl who had flinched at shadows and wept in the forsaken garden, was gone. 5 months. That's how long it had been since I arrived. 5 months since Azura had taken my eye and set me on this strange, twisting path. I touched the patch over my missing eye. The pain was a memory now, something I could barely feel. I often thought of what Azura had said about this world being a place of opportunity, to suffer, and through suffering, to grow. It made sense now, at least to an extent. And yet, a small, stubborn part of me lingered. A part that would never forget, and never forgive. I wondered if that, too, would fade with time, or if that old bitterness was part of me now, as inseparable as the scars on my arms. As for my suspicions about Azura, I told myself I'd buried them with the gloom of winter. During lessons, I no longer spent my time watching her in fear. No more second-guessing every word that passed between us. No more tight, crawling dread whenever she said or did something that sounded vaguely ominous. "Who's that supposed to be?" I asked, tapping the page of an ancient tome she had given me to read. I sat at a table in an open garden, warm light spilling through the canopies above. Azura stood behind me. She inclined her head and followed my finger to the illustration. The figure on the page wasn't quite humanoid, though it was clearly meant to resemble some kind of being. Vast and shadowed, and seemingly very important.
That is the spawn of Naught, the one who tore free, the Sunderer of Light.
"Remarkable titles," I said, raising an eyebrow. "Almost as grand as yours. Does he not have a name?"
His names are countless, child. The Witch Kings of Dimmergap called him Lok. In the pantheon of the ancient Morgar, he was the Nest Lord Karshesh. Throughout the world, he is remembered in innumerable ways. Sometimes as a destroyer, other times as a creator. In Lok Lalesh, he is both. The version you are most likely familiar with, however, is what the Imperial Church has come to call the Worm.
I looked up at her. The Worm? As in, the offspring of the Void? The sire of all evil?
According to myth, he sired the first of the Abyssal Ones. He spearheaded the fight against the Lumea in the War of Dawn, before he turned his back on Inteth and betrayed his own cause. Here, in Loch Lalesh, we speak of him by his proper name.
Which is?
Lokash.
And yet, you worship him, I scoffed, my brow arching even higher.
No, child. He betrayed the Abyss, and the Erdin killed him for it. Vex'Lonkar learned his weakness. Jarraven Dural bit his throat, and Lejena devoured him. But it is a pity. In some ways, he was the architect of the mortal world, before he turned his back on his own creation. Now, he endures in our hearts merely as a warning.
Let me guess. A dreadfully grim warning?
A warning that those who turn their back on the Abyss will be destroyed. Not even the father of the gods was spared that fate.
That sounded very much like a threat, I thought. I studied the shadowed figure on the page for a moment longer, then closed the book with a soft thud, turning back to Azura. You don't scare me, you know.
My child, why would I ever wish to frighten you?
Just a hunch I used to have. After you carved out my eye and all. A surge of heat ran through me as I said it. Not fear, not doubt. If anything, I felt steady, amused, strong enough to meet her gaze without flinching. I waited to see how she'd reply, but the High Priestess said nothing. She merely turned her eyes toward the misty garden beyond the canopies, her expression distant, as though she were turning over riddles I could not begin to grasp. It didn't matter. Keep your secrets, I thought, and found myself smiling. I meant what I said. You don't scare me anymore. Like I said, my suspicions about Azura were buried with the gloom of winter. I no longer spent my days flinching at the thought of her intentions. No more searching her voice for hidden meanings. No more bracing myself whenever her shadow fell across the floor beside me. Or so I told myself. It was easy, in the warmth of spring, to believe I had outgrown my fear. Easy to mistake familiarity for safety. I had trained under her hand, studied at her side, bled in her courtyards and learned her language. I had survived her. And survival has a way of breeding confidence. But some fears do not die. They only sleep. They sink into the dark and wait for the right moment to rise again. As it turned out, I hadn't buried mine very deep, as I was soon to find out. The rumors reached me during a training session with Delara. Word spread quickly that a boat had arrived at the temple, carrying a figure known to all but liked by few, a handseer, shrouded in shadows and suspicion. Duran, Arisith. My body stiffened as I overheard the wardens whispering his name. Even now, the memory of him lingered like a scar. Last time I'd seen him, he'd saved me from Zadhara's lackey, only to later tie me up to the same cart when I dared to fight for my freedom as we crossed the gate at Fort Schultz. He'd handed me over to Ezra and Delara as if I was cattle. The fury and humiliation of those memories still simmered within me. And yet, beneath the anger, something else tugged at me. A strange, reluctant curiosity. The freak had unsettled me in ways I hadn't fully understood at the time. He'd spoken about free will, then bound me the moment I'd exercised my own. He'd spoken about the Erden's teachings with a reverence that had felt hollow. Thinking back now, I realized it. There had been sarcasm in his words, mocking the ideals he claimed to serve.
Kill me,
He'd said.
Why not? Imagine the drama. You swipe my blade, slit my throat, and make a daring escape. Grand stuff, really.
You're mad, I'd replied.
Ha! Madness would be a fucking blessing. But no, Messiah, sadly for both of us, I'm perfectly sane and dead serious. There is always a choice.
He'd kept saying that there's always a choice, as though in need of convincing himself.
Everyone is free as a fucking bird in Lok Lalesh. At least, so it used to be.
What he'd spoken of lay at the very heart of the Zaravian doctrines. The creed that one must exert oneself in the world, to rise above rather than bow down, never to kneel. Through suffering we overcome. Through pain we walk the path of the Erden. And yet, he'd spoken of it like it was some miserable joke to him. Why? A flicker of my old fears surfaced, staring restlessly in the corners of my mind. The teachings of Azura, the hymns, the rituals, my growing understanding of the Abyssal Ones. I'd worked so hard to change my mind about them, to change my mind about her. Memories that had once filled me with dread, such as the nightmare about the children in the forest, had grown dim. I'd even managed to leave my curtains open at night, no longer terrified of unseen eyes peering through the glass. It had been a relief. Finally, I could focus on the present instead of scouring the past and worrying about the future. I could concentrate on learning the Lok Laleshian language and the way of the Erden with Azura, the way of the blade with the Lara. But now, the memory of Dren tugged at the fragile threads of calm I'd fought so hard to achieve. Could I afford to revisit those doubts? For a moment, I teetered on the edge, trying to bury it all, to shove it back down where it couldn't touch me. But my worries were already uncoiling, threading themselves through my mind like a growth breaking through thawing earth. I glanced around, catching the eyes of wardens in the training yard. They looked away when I caught their gazes. A shiver ran down my spine as the fear I'd felt all winter crept back in. Dren hadn't believed a word of what Azura had taught him, had he? An overwhelming urge to know settled inside me. Damn it. Yes. I had to find him. Talk to him one last time. However, where would I even begin to look for him? The Forbidden Temple was vast, a network of terraces, gardens, and ancient pathways that wound through the buildings. Then I remembered something I'd heard in passing. The Hanzira had a tap house on the first terrace, a place for drinking and brooding in the shadows. If Dren was here, surely that was where he'd be.